The COP29 is a great way to position a lot of the things that came out of the ACS in 2023. We don't have an ACS coming up this year, unfortunately. But a lot of the negotiations, a lot of the convenings, and a lot of the conversations that went on at ACS around green transition and just transition, around climate financing and carbon markets, around gender in climate conversations, around youth, around indigenous communities and the loss and damage funds. I think a lot of those talking points, a lot of those negotiation points should continue to feature in COP29. My name is Ifeoma Malo. I am the co-founder and CEO of Clean Technology Hub. We're a hybrid hub focused on energy access, climate action, and sustainable entrepreneurship. And I am a very proud African Climate Ambassador for 2023. I think the idea of becoming an ambassador was an important one for me. I felt like we're now at crossroads where climate negotiations, climate awareness have been heightened. However, I feel like there's a lot, Africa is never on a lot of tables where these conversations are taking place. And so the Climate Ambassadors program gives me an opportunity and a platform to be in rooms where conversations are taking place on climate change or climate action, and where I can be an advocate for the continent on issues that concern my communities. The Ambassador program provides me a lot of platforms around media mentions. It provides me opportunities to moderate webinars. It provides me opportunities to pen down my thoughts and put down op-eds on what the important issues are around climate change on the continent. And it's important to continue to get those voices out. My foray into climate change came from the work I started to do around energy poverty. Africa continues to remain very energy poor. In other words, there are swaths of communities that are unelectrified and who in another 50 to 100 years might not be electrified if not for renewable energy and our ability to build mini grids and microgrids in those countries. It was from that and me understanding the depth of the problem in many of the communities that go beyond electricity and helping to see how building out mini grids can help electrify schools, health centers, but then also the climate change benefits from using clean energy and then helping people start entrepreneurship using clean energy technologies. I think that's where I just saw the ripple effects of the work that we're doing and simply just became, a climate champion. For many of the communities in the Niger Delta that we work with, they've been decimated by climate change, increased floods, and changing weather patterns. So it was very easy for me to say, here is how we want to rebuild. We will not do it the old way. We will look at climate smart agriculture. We'll look at smart buildings. And so that's why I'm very passionate, because the communities I work in are most affected. Yeah, the African Climate Summit was one of a kind. It was the first time that this was happening. And the host country, Kenya, did a great job of bringing in all of the thinkers, all of the advocates, all of the champions, all of the business persons, the private capital, people who are into philanthropy, into one space to define what Africa's climate agenda was going to be at COP28. And this was important because, one of the things that has happened over the years is that while Africa is the lowest emitter, we are beginning to see increased impacts of climate change on many of our communities. But at the same time, we do not have the tools and the finances to address them. And so having this African Climate Summit in Nairobi in 2023 was important for us to sort of frame our own issues in our own way, in our own words. And it was built around offering a robust framework for intergovernmental engagement and consensus building on contentious issues around climate, especially as it relates to Africa. For the longest time, Africa has gone to some of these climate change conferences without a unified voice. And this African Climate Summit provided an opportunity for us to negotiate both as a bloc, but also taking into account our different peculiarities and the different communities that we carry. There's been a growing interest amongst parties to broaden climate action beyond traditional spaces that we see it. and to bring in broader stakeholders. So the decision to host the ACS, the African Climate Summit, was proposed, I think, in 2020, but COVID happened. It was not possible to hold it then, but this was then brought forward to 2023. And when it held, it showcased Africa's opportunity and solutions in terms of being part of the climate conversations and part of the climate solutions as well. And that was what the African Climate Summit was about and tried to achieve. The full meaning of COP is the Conference of Parties. Every year, towards the end of the year, we have a summit between November to December where you hear the word COP very often. This is because the UNFCCC COP, UNFCCC COP is scheduled to take place after many other important activities, including after the United Nations General Assembly UNGA. And therefore, COP becomes the last significant event that brings together global thinkers, global leaders, heads of states, global philanthropy, activists, entrepreneurs, and the business and development community. The first COP came off the back of the 11th session of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee for a Framework Convention on Climate Change. This had itself come after the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. And the principal focus for COP1 was to kickstart negotiations to strengthen the global response to climate change. Negotiations were guided by recommendations from both the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice and the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. How COP happens is that parties agree to submit national communications detailing their measures for limiting anthropogenic emissions with the aim of launching a coordinated global effort. And since COP1, there's been many others, including COP28 being held in the UAE last year, and COP29 being held in 2024, this year in Azerbaijan. I think there were three key outcomes for the COP last year and even the African Climate Summit. The first is with the African Climate Summit, because in COP28, there had been launched a loss and damage fund. It was an opportunity and it provided a fulcrum for Africans and African leaders to begin to talk about how the deployment of that fund should look like and what Africa's position should be for its own indigenous communities. And so for the first time, we were hearing things about how there had to be climate justice applied to the deployment of funds for the loss and damage funds, and how African indigenous communities are somehow left out of the conversation generally. I think the second outcome was also around the use of financing and financing tools and what this means for Africa. For the first time, we're beginning to see Africa on the table and as part of the negotiations for what a carbon trading and carbon emission would look like. And this means that with Africa being part of the definition of what a carbon market would look like, there's the less likely scenario of us not being part of designing what a future climate future would look like. A lot of work also was done around adaptation and resilience projects and programs, and defining it with our communities, African communities in mind, especially around agriculture and especially around restoration, land restoration. And so we see that there was a concerted effort from the ACS, from the African Climate Summit, to give Africa a force, a push to be better negotiations at COP and to have a very more streamlined demands during the negotiations, and also to bring communities that are usually left behind outside of these negotiations into the room. The last thing that I will say is that Africa's youth has now been positioned as a global force. We're finding that our young people and the talents and the energy and the resilience that they have, it is what is pushing a lot of the conversations around climate. And so the question again from African Climate Summit is, how do we harness this youth energy and connect it to a lot of the global youth movements when it comes to climate, and make sure that young people are also part of defining what the future of climate would be. These are some of the outcomes, positive outcomes of the African Climate Summit. It was great to have COP28 finally acknowledge that fossil fuels are the root cause of climate change, and an agreement, a consensus to phase down the drilling of fossil fuel. The other thing that happened at COP28 was the pledge on the loss and damage fund, running into over almost 800 million USD. Even though this comes short of what we need for the climate finance to address the climate issues on the continent or even globally, at least it shows some progress. What it did was that it highlighted the opportunities and solutions that the African continent offers to the global community when it comes to climate action. Like I said before, Africa has a bulging youth population, and that is so talented, very energetic, very aware, and also very focused on global issues, including climate. So Africa's youth has decided that climate change is going to be one of the biggest fights of the century, and are in the room making demands and negotiating as well. This was what ACS taught us, that we have to put them on the negotiation table and that we have to equip them with the tools for global audiences. And so this was one of the positive outcomes of the ACS for us. And we could see that play out in COP29, where we had a lot of youth leaders across the continent being on panels, being part of the conversations, global conversations, and even giving keynote addresses during the whole of the summit. The second thing is Africa has plenty arable land and has enough to use it to feed the world. And so with the advancement of climate smart agriculture, we're seeing increasingly that there is a huge demand for land in Africa. What Africa has to do is to also be able to get its indigenous communities, get its own business communities around producing food for the rest of the nations, for the rest of the countries and continents. And so one of the advantages in COP28, and that we're hoping to continue in COP29, is a climate smart agriculture as a basis for climate, both climate adaptation and climate mitigation and climate resilience can be built around our climate action on the continent and as something that we offer to the rest of the world. The other thing is the whole carbon trading markets. Because Africa continues to have very low carbon footprints, we see that there is a huge demand for our carbon trading. So Africa is in a good place where the demand is coming from outside to actually negotiate harder for what we're getting for our lower carbon footprints. What we have to do, however, is to teach our people about what this carbon market is and how to negotiate better and make sure that they take advantage of the emerging carbon markets. And lastly, on the operationalizing of the loss and damage fund, it is important that, now that we have the fund existing in some form, as it evolves, that our own climate finance experts, climate account experts, climate carbon and climate trading experts are upskilled enough to be part of those negotiations and part of those conversations in a way that brings a lot of that benefits back to the continent. But these are some of the outcomes of the COP28 and ACS that I think we will continue to have be platforms for conversation in COP29. I think where our challenges lie is also where our opportunities lie. One of the challenges is that we're so far behind when it comes to development. So there's always the argument about the fact that Africa is least developed, and so that we need to use our fossil fuel to build up our continent. However, the truth is that we still don't have those capacities right now. And the world is moving to a greener future. And so we can see a situation where Africa will be left behind again in the next industrialization era if we do not leapfrog. So the fact that we're starting from ground zero when it comes to the green economy can be an advantage, but it's also considered a disadvantage. The advantage is very similar to what happened with the mobile phones in Africa, which have become widely spread and the most singular popular means of doing business in Africa. We can leapfrog our technologies, our green technologies for development, like we did the mobile phones, to make sure that we're taking advantage of the green economy. We've talked about how we have to finance this. I think that's the big question. Well, this is where the carbon market and carbon trading come in, because if this is a market that is going to exist, then Africa has to determine has to be part of determining what that market is, what the market forces are, and how it benefits the continent in the long run. And so when we talk about challenges and opportunities, the challenges are the opportunities, and it's just a simple question of how we're framing this. There has to be. And this is going to become much more a prominent call that goes on much more in future COPs, I think starting from COP29. The idea that we don't put any timeline to the phase down of fossil fuel makes complete nonsense of the whole idea of even COP and COP negotiations. If we have agreed that the singular biggest reason for climate change is fossil fuel, and we do not have a timeline for facing that down, then, I'm not quite sure where we're starting from. If we're going to build a green economy and build it fast and make sure that there are no countries left behind, then we need to actually negotiate, sit down as a global body and negotiate and say, we have to put a timeline for the phase down of fossil fuel. I think the biggest thing is that governments, African governments have to come in. And it starts from policy and laws and regulations. I'll take Nigeria or even Kenya, for instance. One of the things that we've been struggling with in Nigeria is to get the government to give zero tariffs and taxes to the importation of maybe solar panels, batteries, charge controllers, anything that has to do with clean energy. And it's been difficult. We have seen in societies or in countries where this has been done, where the governments have come and given a zero duty and tariff on renewable energy imports. We have seen how that has created a bigger adoption of renewable energy products, services, technologies in those countries. And some of those countries across Africa have even leapfrogged to having renewable energy assembly plants and even renewable energy manufacturing plants. And that's because the government has done its job of policy regulation and market enabler to ensure that investors, entrepreneurs, and business persons take advantage of these incentives and then build in the country. We have to build our continent. And the way to build it and take advantage of the green economy is if governments are deliberate about the policies they make when it comes to clean energy, renewable energy, green infrastructure. Those things have to be priority in the way that the government frames them. The solution to our energy transition is put a date on the phase down of fossil fuel. Then put together catalytic financing around adoption of clean energy and renewable energy and clean energy infrastructure, green buildings, a green build. Without doing the large-scale infrastructure that is needed to transition people from using, fossil-dependent infrastructure, we're not going to get very far. And so it's both the policy part, but there's also financing part. We have to also begin to tax heavily the fossil fuel industry as a disincentive to get people to transition to green energy. Then we also have to use and leverage that money from that taxation to begin to build greener infrastructure. And then thirdly, and most importantly, there's also the behavioral change aspect. There has to be mass communications, the AU, the ECOWAS, the ACAP, everybody has to come together and say that we're going to do a public orientation around green energy, transitioning people from using biomass, transitioning people from using kerosene for cooking or for lighting, or even candles. There has to be a mass public orientation to enable that behavioral change, because without also that aspect of the work, people are bound to continue to use what they know, even if the alternatives are better. I think this is where Africa's domestic market has a potential. For far too long, I think Africa has depended on aid from the West, and has not, looked into its own domestic market for financing a lot of its development. So African countries need to maximize on the climate change development nexus and put in place a lot of policies and programs that allows the domestic market grow and to meet this financing shortfall. We're increasingly seeing that happen, where a lot of our financial institutions are now trying to design what would be a climate fund. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, and that they need help in sort of structuring it in a way that actually addresses the climate development needs of the continent. I think the launch of the fund is a good thing. I think it's also a good thing for Africa to know that there is a loss and damage fund. But it's also one of the slight disadvantages of the framing of that fund for Africa is that we're just recipients. I think one of the things we should also think about is what can we contribute to that fund that is non-monetary in some ways, right? Just so that we're on an equal playing field. One of the things about always being the recipient of what can be considered in any form aid, or even if it's a loss and damage fund that is talking about reparation, is that sometimes you lose the ability or the dignity that you deserve, even on the negotiation table. One of the things we want to see is a lot of well-positioned Africans on negotiations tables saying, this is what we bring and here is what we want. And not just saying, here is what we want, here is what we want, but then the question is, what are you bringing? And so this leads me to some of the things that I said earlier about we're bringing talent. We have a youth bulge who are willing and able to work and knock on doors and break down barriers to be in rooms where they need to be. They're driving finance, they're driving technology, they're driving media. So we have that. We have land, we have low emissions. And we should use these things to negotiate when we're asking for a lot of the loss and damage funds. So here's how it works. You go up on that table, here is what we want for our reparations. And if you give us this money, here is how we plan to double it for development in our countries or our continent. That should be the approach on the loss and damage fund. The loss and damage fund, for the first time, is speaking about reparations and social justice. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not quite sure why people think otherwise, that that there should be no reparations paid for a lot of the pollution and pollutants that have happened over the years. I think of my country, Nigeria, that is a huge oil and gas country, and that has had communities decimated for years. And most of those communities, some of them might never recover. They can't recover their commercial fishing, livelihoods. They cannot recover from the bad water, the polluted waters and the streams. They can't recover from the many years of neglect and even the brutalization in connivance between the government and the oil companies. And so the question is, why should that not be compensated? Why should those not be compensated? And you can extrapolate this story of Nigeria to several other countries, whether you have mining communities, whether anywhere you have extractives on the continent, you have the same stories. The same globally, not just in Africa, the same globally in communities where there's been extractive minerals. And so why should there not be reparations for those things? I actually feel that every developed country that has built its nation on the backs of a lot of these communities and those countries that host those communities should get a huge chunk of these loss and damage funds. And it's not reparation. It's not aid per se, it's reparation. It's compensation for the years lost and the damage done. The COP29 is a great way to position a lot of the things that came out of the ACS in 2023. We don't have an ACS coming up this year, unfortunately. But a lot of the negotiations, a lot of the convenings, and a lot of the conversations that went on at ACS around green transition and just transition around climate financing and carbon markets, around gender in climate conversations, around youth, around indigenous communities and the loss and damage funds. I think a lot of those talking points, a lot of those negotiation points should continue to feature in COP29. We got to some place in COP28. At least the admittance that fossil fuel is a problem. The beginning of the operationalizing of the the loss and damage fund. I think where we take that to is to have Africa be on the table around how that's operationalized. And I think one of the other things we need to do is to begin to think about how we want to finance our carbon future in Africa. What are we doing domestically that we can use and leverage more funding from outside of the continent? There is no time to waste anymore. The climate emergency is happening real life, real time. The time to act is now. So let's get working on building a domestic finance market for climate change.